And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather is showing snow trying to push into the southern southeast coast, light snow. Strong winds continue with cold temperatures in the northern part of the panhandle. Clear skies and cold temperatures central southern Alaska. Clouds increase as you head north here. And winds diminishing along the Arctic coast. Chance of snow north slope. Light snow into the Brooks Range. Storm free over the Bering Sea with a lot of clearing with continued easterly flow, especially over the southern areas in the Aleutians. Kodiak still clear, but look for the clouds to increase tomorrow, especially on the east side of Kodiak Island. Some flurries and light snow linger from the north slope out to the Arctic coast, and dry and mostly clear over interior Alaska. No storms out over the Bering Sea or the Aleutians. We've got this system here over the Northeast Pacific trying to, again, push moisture northward into the southern panhandle, and that actually makes a pretty good jog to the north Friday night and into Saturday. By afternoon, chance of snow all the way up to Juneau, maybe Haines. Increasing winds, but still clear and dry and cold over southern central Alaska and North Gulf Coast and the Bering Sea. Now we've got increasing moisture due to this trough here swinging west-northwestward. So look for increasing chances of snow, Kodiak Island, and that just grazing the Alaska Peninsula on the Pacific side. Coastal water forecast, small craft advisories on the south coast tomorrow. Northeast winds here at 25 knots with higher gusts. And east to northeast winds, 30 to 35 knots on the central coast. And the north coast, lighter winds there out of the northeast, 15 to 25. Storm warnings for Lynn Canal, northeast winds 50 knots, gusting to 50 knots. Northeast winds 30 knots for Stevens Passage, and north at 15 for Clarence Strait. And for Saturday, east winds here, central and south coast at 20 knots in the north coast. East to northeast winds 15 to 25 knots. Lynn Canal winds down to 25 knots, still from the north at 20 for Stevens Passage, and northwest at 15 for Clarence Strait. And for Prince William Sound, Friday, north at 20 knots. And for the eastern North Gulf Coast, we've got variable to northeast winds 10 to 30 knots, northeast at 15 for the western coast. And for the Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay area, north winds at 20 knots. Cook Inlet, variable to northeast winds 10 to 20 knots. And for Saturday, Cook Inlet, north winds 20 to 30 knots. Northeast at 30 for Kamishak Bay, northeast 20 for the Barren Islands and the western North Gulf Coast. About the same on the eastern North Gulf Coast, northeast winds there 20 to 25 knots, and Prince William Sound, northeast wind at 15 knots. Kodiak Island on Friday, northeast winds 30 knots. Alaska Peninsula, north to northeast winds 25 to 30 knots, and Bristol Bay, northeast winds 25 knots with 5-foot seas. And for Bristol Bay on Saturday, northeast winds 30 knots now with 8-foot seas. In the Alaska Peninsula, north to northeast winds 25 to 30 knots with seas running from 7 to 12 feet. Kodiak Island, no change. Northeast winds 30 knots. Eastern Aleutians, eastern and central Aleutians, in fact, from Unalaska Island to Kiska, winds northeast at 30 knots. And from Kiska to Shemya, east winds 25 knots. And for the day Saturday, western Aleutians out this way, Amchitka to Shemya, northeast winds 30 to 35 knots, northeast at 30 for Adak and Atka, and for the eastern Aleutians, north to northeast winds at 30 to 35 knots. For the southwest coast on Friday, we've got north winds at 25 to 30 knots here, northeast 30 for the Pribilofs, north at 20 for St. Matthew Island. Yukon Delta Coast, north winds 25 knots, Norton Sound, north at 20. And for Saturday, brisk wind advisories now for Norton Sound, north winds at 25 knots. St. Lawrence Island, northeast winds at 30 knots, north winds 30 knots to the Yukon Delta Coast. Gale warnings here south of Nunivak Island, north winds 35 knots. And then those turn northeast at 35 knots as they blow across the Pribilof Islands. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, west winds 20 knots, northwest 20 on the central coast. And the west side, lighter winds, northwest at 15 knots. And the Chukchi Sea looking at north winds at 20 knots. And for Saturday for the Chukchi Sea, north winds 15 to 20 knots, while the western coast, light winds at 10 knots, central Arctic coast, light northwest winds at 10 knots. and west winds 15 to 30 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast.